It's my great honor to present our speaker today, Dr. Rex Brynen, a pioneer in the field of wargaming and simulations. For those of us who were his graduate students a long time ago at McGill University, we remember very well how he used to mobilize an army of TAs, teaching assistants, to help him in his simulation. When we were thinking of the internet and online technology as a mode of emails and messages, he was putting together simulations for ethnic conflicts between the state of Brynania and the Zaharians. Many years later, we are now in the midst of complex wargamings, and so it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce you, Rex. Professor Rex Brynen is professor at McGill University. He is senior editor of the conflict simulation website Paxisms. He has worked as a consultant on wargaming or serious game design to the Canadian Department of National Defence, Global Affairs Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, the US State Department, the UK Ministry of Defence, NATO, the Atlantic Council, Chatham House, and the READY Initiative, and the WHO. Has also worked on conflict-related humanitarian and development issues to various governments, UN agencies, and the World Bank, and also consulted on intelligence assessment to the Canadian Privy Council Office. He is, of course, author and co-author and editor of a dozen books on various aspects of Middle East politics and security, including the excellent Beyond the Arab Spring. Rex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So today I'm here to talk to you about wargaming, and insecurity, and strategic studies. And there, we'll come back to this image later on, because there we see two war games going on. The one on the left is a war game about the liberation of West Mosul from ISIS control in 2017. The one on the right is a conflict simulation at King's College London in conjunction with a conference, and there most of the people you see in that room are security professionals or wargaming professionals. So I'm going to come back to those images a little bit later on. But I want to start, it's always good to start with a quote. And I will also come back to these quotes. So let's start with one from the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, who said, "In the whole range of human activities, war most resembles a game of cards." And also a quote from Thomas Schelling, who of course won a Nobel Prize in economics for his work in game theory and strategic bargaining, who said, "The one thing that a person cannot do, no matter how rigorous his or her analysis or heroic his or her imagination is to draw up a list of things that would never have occurred to him or her." So I'm going to come back to both of those quotes in a minute and talk about why they're relevant to what we're talking about today. So there is a written paper as well, which I've sent in on time and everything. I'm quite impressed with myself. And the written paper is full of lots of words and many footnotes and hardly any pictures, but does provide a kind of structured overview with lots of references of the things I'm going to talk about today. And if you want a copy of that, you can just email me and I'll send you the PDF. This, however, today you get me with lots of pictures and exciting verbal commentary and examples of how games can enhance learning and analysis, because I thought I'd taken advantage of the fact that you can all see the screen, and therefore I can sort of graphically show you what I'm talking about. And there will be opportunity for Q&A at the end. So what is wargaming? Wargaming is the application of serious games to issues of armed conflict. Indeed, wargaming was in many ways the first serious game. And I don't mean wargaming in the sense of abstract games of strategy like chess or Go, which were indeed used to encourage nobles and other thinkers to think in strategic terms. But the original serious game, the original attempt to make a realistic portrayal of a situation in a game environment for people to learn their craft was Prussian Kriegspiel. Was 19th century, the first Prussian wargaming, which was developed to teach military officers about the actual conduct of military operations, a game designed to have life or death implications in terms of the quality of the officer corps it helped to produce. Games, there's lots of definition of games, that they're structured forms of play. They tend to be adversarial or competitive. You're playing against someone else, or you're playing against the game system or the computer or what have you. Serious games are those that have educational or analytical purpose. And here, when I talk about wargaming today, we'll talk both about educational or training gaming, that is to say, you're using it in the classroom to help teach strategic studies, and analytical gaming, that you're using gaming to answer a policy question or a social science research question. I'm also, in keeping with the fact that we have a critical security studies program here, I'm not going to talk about wargaming just about military operations. I'm going to expand that to address many other forms of human security and many forms of political, social, and economic conflict. And indeed, most of my serious game design is conflict adjacent. It's not necessarily the conduct of military operations, though occasionally I do that too. It's about other aspects of war. So I think it fits nicely with the way that the security studies program sees itself here in Doha. So here on the screen, you can see some classic war games. Top left is a NATO war game looking at the use of so-called intermediate force capabilities, which is essentially non-lethal weapon systems. And they're using the professional version of a hobby war game, Command. If you were able to look very closely, you'd see that the cunning red commander is about to conduct an ambush on a blue naval task force, because I know that because I was the cunning red commander. On the top right, you'll see Strike, which is a board game developed by DSTL, the British Ministry of Defense, to help train sort of combined arms tactics. The bottom left is another picture of the Dire Straits simulations we ran at KCL. Bottom right is Hegemony, and yes, it is spelt that way with a D, because it is about US allocation of national security resources to hedge against multiple emerging threats. And RAND produced that as a board game to be used in the policy environment and in the security training environment to help people to think about the kind of long-term security challenges and resource challenges the US faces. And it's a boxed game. A very expensive boxed game you can now buy from RAND. So those are all, I think, classic war games. But as I said, you can use serious gaming to address other aspects of the broader security agenda. Here is one example. It's a game I developed called Aftershock, which is about humanitarian coordination. It's loosely modeled on the Haiti earthquake. And on the right, you see one of my favorite pictures. It captures the learning value of gaming, because the two students there that are clutching their foreheads have just realized that with the best of intentions, they did something very stupid, which happens all the time in real life. And I think part of the value of a game is to help people understand why things weren't coordinated, why something that was done that was suboptimal. And they're just done something suboptimal because of pressures of time and communication and target fixation. They were so focused on one issue, they weren't thinking about another issue, and they have at that very moment realized that they forgot to do something important. I'm glad I captured that on camera. I use this in the classroom, but it gets used far more broadly. So there we can see the top tweets, the US Marines and the US Army War College using it. Bottom left, 40 Royal Marine Commando using it for training. Top right, Royal Fleet Auxiliary, so that's the Royal Navy using it for training. The bottom right, international relations colleagues in Portugal using it for training at all. And as I say, it's a game not about conflict, but something that militaries are often called upon to do, which is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Here you see some other games, and we yesterday had an excellent discussion of health security, and all of these are essentially health or biosecurity games. In the top right, that's not actually a game, that's General Fortier, the Canadian Armed Forces. At a press conference, we gamed out the Canadian COVID-19 vaccine distribution plans nationally. 140 participants, all 10 provinces, 3 territories, 6 government agencies in a full day in order to stress test the plan. The outcome of that game was briefed to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and there was a follow-up discussion with Cabinet. And that's actually a national press conference in Canada announcing the game that we had just done. Bottom right, this is a biosecurity game. African swine fever is a disease that affects pork production. It's a devastating disease. It may have led to a culling of up to a quarter of the world's pigs a few years ago. And Agriculture Canada has multi-million dollar contingency plans that they spent years preparing. Here we're using a game to stress test those plans and identify possible problems with them. The woman on the far left is, in fact, the Associate Deputy Minister of Agriculture, so the #2 bureaucrat in that department. Top left is a game I'm currently working on with the READY Initiative, which is Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and Save the Children and a number of other NGOs, to do games-based training around disease, outbreak readiness, and response in humanitarian settings. It's the second game. The first one is on the READY Initiative website already. The bottom left is a prototype for the World Health Organization of moving some of its in-person training on, again, infectious disease outbreak response to a digital environment. I'm not convinced it's always a good idea to move it to a digital environment, but they wanted to see what it looked like when they moved it to a digital environment. So here we can see, although the title of the talk is Wargaming, we can see all those other things related to security that we've already talked about at the conference, all being manifested in games for either purposes of training, the two pictures on the left here, or for the purposes of actual contingency planning or in the case of COVID-19, disease response in a government. So, although I'm going to say lots of positive things about the use of wargaming and serious games in security studies, I think it's really important to note at the outset that serious gaming is not a magic wand. It's not a magic wand. It doesn't automatically do things well. You can design a game around the wrong question. That's asking the wrong questions and therefore getting the wrong answers. There's a modeling problem. Every game involves a model of reality, and that model can be wrong, and you can have a garbage in, garbage out problem in that model as well. There's the challenge of idiosyncrasy. We're talking about games that involve human players, and those human players may act in odd ways. They may not act like their real-life counterparts. You may get very different outcomes from a game with different players because of personality or ideology or professional training or what have you. And when we run analytical games, we almost always run very small numbers of them, frequently one. And we do know the problems of drawing conclusions from a sample size of one. So you have to be, although games can be used for analytical purposes, they can only really be used in conjunction with other methods because of that problem that we can't do repetitions simply because of the amount of time and effort it takes. However, games can be very useful tools, and I think we should think of games not as the be-all and end-all of as educational tools or as analytical tools, but simply a tool in a toolbox, which sometimes is quite useful. Games, when done well, can be a moderately effective teaching device. They're not automatically better than other methods, but they're quite good. They can be very positive. They are an excellent way of synthesizing what I call subject matter knowledge and process matter knowledge. The world is full of very intelligent, thoughtful people doing suboptimal things because of cognitive reasons, because of pressures, because of coordination issues, because of, say, target fixation focused on one aspect of the problem, not other. It is very hard in the classroom to teach about fog and friction, because your students will read the best practices guide. How do we demobilize combatants after a civil war? It seems perfectly obvious, doesn't it? I mean, here's all the processes of DDR. This is how we do them. It never works out that well. It never works out that smoothly. And a simulation can force students to confront the actual fog and friction of whether it's military operations or peace operations or humanitarian operations, all the things that can and do go wrong and why they go wrong. There's quite a lot of research evidence that suggests that being immersed in playing a game produces better learning than just thinking about a role. Role playing produces better learning than role thinking. Reading about Vladimir Putin is not as effective as having to play Vladimir Putin in a simulation of the war in Ukraine. And designing a game, there's evidence, produces even more learning than simply playing a game. And I like to think of gaming as just kind of an intellectual cross-training, because if you all cast your mind back, and for me it was quite a long time ago, to when we were students, lectures get a bit boring after a while. Reading textbooks gets a bit boring after a while. And I think a powerful argument for games in the classroom is our students are human beings, and every once in a while they'd like to do something else and not struggle to stay awake in our lectures. So it's just simply exercising slightly different mental muscles as part of the educational process. And I think that's, in fact, one of the most powerful arguments for using games. As analytical tools, serious gaming offers, I think, possibly unique perspectives on how capability, context, and human decision-making interact. I think serious gaming can generate new insights into old problems. Serious gaming, when it's done well, crowdsources ideas from diverse participants. And I'll add that in professional wargaming, that little logo there is the logo of the Darby House Principles on diversity and inclusion in professional wargaming, and it's now become a professional standard in professional wargaming that you want to strive to be diverse and inclusive with regard to gender, minorities, LGBT, professional training, background, class, etc., because a diverse group of participants will get you better outputs than a bunch of middle-aged old men, well, middle-aged men, straight men in a room who all think identically, who've gone through similar professional training. That really isn't going to crowdsource a lot of interesting ideas than a more diverse group of participants. And serious games can be part of an experimental methodology. So there are people who've run games over and over again, not in n=1, in order to look at such things as nuclear escalation or the impact of UAVs and drones on crisis stability and escalation, and so forth. So I want to go back to these two quotes. I should probably add that we're not absolutely sure that Karl von Clausewitz wrote that, because he really wrote On War with his wife, Marie. She's the one who pulled it all together after his death, because he kept losing his drafts and didn't write very well. So Karl and possibly Marie said that conflict at war is like a game of cards, because you have imperfect information, because you have an adaptive adversary, because you're having to manage risk. You're taking calculated risks with imperfect information. And that is why war is like a game. And that's why I think that if we're going to understand war, games are a useful way of doing so. Thomas Schelling is notable because Tom Schelling, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on formal modeling of strategic interaction, game theory, also thought it wasn't perfect and you needed to run actual games with people. He ran for over a decade political military games at Rand, and remained up until his death a strong advocate of person-in-the-loop games, because he was aware that real people didn't behave like his game theoretic models. And so I think if someone wins a Nobel Prize for formal theory, game theory, it says, yeah, but it's not enough. You actually need to run person-in-the-loop games with human participants to fully understand. One of the things he used to say, for example, is every game we ever ran on nuclear signaling, no one understood the signals. They'd either misunderstand the signals, or they'd miss the signals, or they'd think something was a signal that wasn't a signal. It left him profoundly dubious about signaling in a nuclear crisis. He discovered that from games, not from any of his work on game theory. So that's why I have both of those quotes there. So in the written paper, I go through the steps of designing and implementing a war game. Determining your objectives, which surprisingly few people do at times, considering who your players are, the resources you have to design and run your game, then getting into the war game design process, which involves trade-offs between accuracy and playability. You can have a highly accurate game that's frankly unplayable, or a really easy to play game that's so abstracted that it's telling you nothing useful about the conflicts. You've got to find a middle point there. I talk about different methods of adjudication. Do we have pre-written rules? Is it hard-coded into computer software? Are there umpires deciding on outcomes? I talk about turn-based games, continuous games, digital and manual games, the importance of components and the kind of user interface. I talk about the process of developing and refining the game. And more importantly, I have a whole stack of footnotes in the paper where you can read much, much, much more about this stuff as well. And in the paper, and this is what I'll do a little bit of here in the time remaining, I talk about different kinds of of game formats and some of the strengths and weaknesses. And in the paper, I also give some examples. A lot of those examples are my examples, not because my games are any better than anyone else's, but because I'm aware of the process whereby they were designed in certain ways to do certain things. So I'm sort of aware of how the objectives and the audience and the resources shape the design decisions, and I'm not always aware of that with someone else's game. So I'm going to talk through, in the time that remains before Q&A, very quickly I'm going to go through some game formats, from the ones that I think are easiest to use in security studies to the ones that I think are hardest. And I may not say all the points on the slides because I know we don't have an endless amount of time. So seminar games. Seminar games are the easiest form of wargaming. They're also, in some ways, one of the most frequently used form of wargaming in government. And in a seminar game, essentially, you're broken up into teams, you're given your role briefings, and you're given a scenario. In this particular case at Johns Hopkins in 2018, I wasn't involved in this, is the outbreak of a novel disease. And then you go back to your teams and you have maybe an hour, hour and a half to make a series of decisions. What would we do? Maybe we talk to the other teams, and then we present the control team with, this is what we want to do. You all go on a coffee break or a lunch break. The control team then decides, given what everyone said they did, what would be the next step in the scenario. They update the scenario based on everyone's actions. You come back again. You have your discussion. The scenario is updated. You deal with the updated situation. You decide what you're going to do. There's another break. The situation is updated again. And you do that 3 or 4 times. And it's called a seminar game because it's not dissimilar to a seminar or a conference, except for you have that scenario to focus on and you're broken into multiple teams. That's what's going on here in this Johns Hopkins sim. A bunch of these were run pre-COVID on the dangers of a global pandemic. Ironically, all these games were then fodder for the COVID conspiracy theorists who used them as evidence that Bill Gates had pre-planned COVID-19, because why else would there be academic conferences on disease, on outbreak preparedness? So this actual seminar gets cited as an example of the evil conspiracy that was manufactured COVID-19. They're very easy to run. Very little time to write the role briefings and do the scenario. They work very well, and if you're doing them with students, your students are all in role. You can run them over an extended period of time. They don't have to be run in the same day. You could literally run one over a term in which the scenario gets updated at the end of each week. You can do them asynchronously. You can do them remotely. Professional wargamers sometimes poo-poo them and are a bit cynical about them because they see them overly used. There are some problems with them. One of them is there's not much opportunity for adversarial interaction if it only has 3 turns, and you all put, and there's also, you aren't able, an OODA loop is something used in the military originally for fighter pilots to discuss the speed at which you make a decision. So you observe, orient, decide, and act. And in real life, sometimes the speed at which you make a decision, particularly in an adversarial situation, but also with regard to a disease outbreak, is important. These lose that because everyone's turn is due at the same time, like handing in your homework, and then it is updated. There's no advantage in making a decision quickly and efficiently faster than a rival team in this. So there are some problems with regard to interaction in these games, but they're really easy to design and run, and I think is a good place to start. Negotiation games, most of us know these. It's the Model UN type situation. We have a conflict. Can we sit down and negotiate peace in Ukraine or Israel-Palestine and Nagorno-Karabakh or whatever it is? You break your participants into teams. They have their briefings. They have the situation. They try and negotiate an outcome. You don't really have to adjudicate because it's whether they can come up with an agreement or not. They can also be played remotely, distributed, asynchronously, slowly over time. I think they're quite easy to do. The fact that undergraduate students organize them all over the world all the time suggests that they shouldn't be beyond our skills to develop in the classroom. The one at McGill, McMunn, has like 1,000 participants and rents the entire Sheraton for a week, which is bigger than any of the academic conferences McGill profs ever organized. The one challenge here, I think, is getting realistic negotiating behavior because your students aren't constrained by the worldviews of the actual combatants in the conflict. They're not facing the same political challenge. You have to make sure they don't give away the store. If it's an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation and the two sides sit down and they say, well, you can have Jerusalem, we don't want it. No, it's fine, you can have it. It's okay, why don't we just agree? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's not a very accurate Israeli-Palestinian negotiation, but your undergraduate students might well do that in their desire to reach an agreement. So you have to think about how you're going to constrain your negotiators and how you're going to immerse them in their worldview so they get really angry when the other side suggests they give up Jerusalem. There's a lot of psychological manipulation in good game design. You want your players to really feel that they're playing the role. Assignment games, this is something I use a lot, though no one ever writes about them as such. An assignment game is where you're given a scenario briefing, you're broken into teams, but you're not different actors, you're just different versions of the same actor. So there's a crisis. Your homework is you have 2.5 hours to provide a briefing to your senior decision maker on how to respond to this situation, and you have other people role-playing stakeholders. Now, I've used this in a couple of serious contexts. For a decade, we did covert decision support for these Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Canadian government initiative, but with the EU and the State Department. We'd often stress test ideas that were emerging in negotiations, and we sometimes did that in the form of a negotiation game. Here's a particular problem around Palestinian refugees, compensation, for example. You've got 2.5 hours to argue how this should be dealt with. We'll have people role-playing Jordan and the donors in Lebanon and Syria, and we will then look at all the options everyone's come up with. The bottom one was a game we ran for UNRWA, which is the UN agency that deals with Palestinian refugees, about what they would do if they faced a major cut in US funding. And then a few years later, the Trump administration cut funding to UNRWA, so it was fairly prescient. The level of interest in that can be seen by the fact that the guy standing kind of in front of the door there is Filippo Grandi, who at the time was head of UNRWA and is now head of UNHCR. So our judge there as to what was a useful brief back was the actual head of the agency as to what the teams were producing. I must admit, in that last one, I socially engineered it so two of the teams were all senior experts. One of them was just graduate students, which then terrified all of the senior experts into working super hard for fear that the head of UNRWA would decide that the graduate students had the most useful brief. So if you ever want to get academics to actually work at a conference well past midnight on their PowerPoint slides and not spend forever drinking over dinner, what you do is you put a competitive student, because the graduate students were hungry. They were hungry. They were anxious to humiliate their profs by winning the competition. They never slept. So none of my senior experts did either. These are quite easy to organize. You can do them with various size groups. The only problem is there's no living with the consequences. There's no doing something and seeing how it turned out, because essentially it's a single brief on a single situation on this is what I think we should do. So those first three, I think, are really, really easy to run and organize in a class. They're not far off some of the skills we use in our seminars already. We're going to start to get into things that are a little more complicated. These are matrix games. Matrix games have become hugely popular in the defense sector because they're frankly quite easy to design and run. One on the bottom, you'll recognize it, it's counter-ISIS operations in Iraq. The one at the top is a fictional coup planning game, which is really used to showcase how you can bring a whole range of political and social and other factors into a matrix game. We're running it there at the UK Ministry of Defense. The way a matrix game works is you have usually about 5 or 6 players or teams, and when it's your turn, you get to only do one thing. That's a fault of a matrix game. But you can do anything. There are no rules. You can do anything you could really do. All you have to do is say, I am doing so-and-so with the following desired effect, and I think I will be successful for these reasons. So you describe an action, its intended outcome, and the arguments in favor of it working. The rest of the players then throw in arguments for and against, and usually they're throwing in arguments against. So you get a huge discussion over the feasibility of that course of action and all the enabling and constraining variables, and then you turn those into a probability for success. You can have the participants all vote on the probability of success and choose the median probability and roll dice against it. You can use a system of die roll modifiers going up or down, +1 for each pro argument, -1 for each con argument. But essentially, adjudication is done by the players themselves. And it's a great way of harnessing insight from thoughtful players. You can run a game in about 3 hours. that DSTL session in the beginning, of the top there rather, we designed a Lebanon matrix game in an hour-and-a-half session, and I put it together in the hotel room that evening in terms of physical components, and we played it the next day. So, they can be designed quite quickly. So there are drawbacks to them, but the fact that you can run them fairly easily, and they're easy to play because all you do is make an argument. I think this is my best course of action. It will have this effect. These are the reasons why it would work. Here are the reasons why it won't work. And analytically, every game produces a list of enabling and constraining factors. Regardless of whether it works in the game, analytically, it's producing an analysis of all the variables that shape outcome for particular courses of action. So you can harness all that, and it's very, very useful. But you're only doing one thing at a time. You also don't have to be doing that in person. This is a game I ran for the New Yorker and on the U.S. election before the U.S. election, before January 6th. And we had a January 6th, so it turned out to be fairly accurate in terms of predicting outcomes. And this was just run on Google Slides and Zoom. Right? That's literally how it was all run with fake media injects and election results and so forth. Now, this is where it starts getting hard, is when you design actual board games with rigid rules, with pre-written rules. This is a process that takes months to years to design a board game that will deliver what you want reliably, doesn't have flaws in it that players will exploit. Now, this is what in early Kriegspiel was known as rigid Kriegspiel, because there are written rules, as opposed to free Kriegspiel, where the umpires are deciding outcomes. It can work very well, particularly when you have known things. If you're modeling combat operations and those are fairly well understood, you can write rules that reflect that quite well. It works less well if you're dealing with a lot of unknown unknowns in the subject matter that you're looking at. Another problem with a board game is usually only so many people can group around the board. It's perhaps a bit easier if you port it digitally. There may be some commercial board games that are possible for use in a classroom, but it is not impossible. And I say it's not impossible. You see that the bottom is We Are Coming Nineveh, which is a game that's just come out now, just being published. A couple of my students did the initial design on it, and a couple of us joined them after the course is over to make it publishable. It's a game of the liberation of West Mosul. The bottom is what it looks like now, coming out from the publisher. The top is a early playtesting version of it. And I love this image because the person who is currently there in the white shirt moving Iraqi security forces as they surround the old city in West Mosul is Commander Phil Pornell, who was one of the most senior wargamers at the Pentagon at the time. Very, very positive about the game. And the young woman, Juliette Limenez, who's sitting there with a bottle of soft drink watching him play, is the original game designer. So if she can design a game that impresses one of the heads of wargaming inside the Pentagon, then you ought to be able to do it. Now, I chose that picture. It makes Juliette look smaller than she actually is. She looks like she's about 6 there, and she's not. She's now got a graduate degree and works in Beirut in international development. But the point remains, if an undergraduate can produce, this game was actually, UK MOD asked us for a pre-production copy because they wanted to evaluate its insights into modern urban warfare. And it was originally designed by 2 undergraduate students. So clearly it's not impossible. On the other hand, you'll notice that it's being printed in 2023, and we're still playtesting it in 2018. So that's a 5-6 year development process before we thought we had the kinks out of it enough. There are lots of commercially published games you can use. Diplomacy and Risk I've got up there because they're 2 very well-known war games or games about war. Some others, 1812 Invasion of Canada, I use in the classroom. Battle for Moscow as a simple introduction to what we call hex and chit wargaming. Twilight Struggle is a very popular board game about the Cold War. Distant Plain is one of a series of counterinsurgency games that are very successful. You can use commercial games, but you have to be careful because they're usually not designed for classroom use. The first 2, I think, give hyper-realist versions of international relations, which are flatly wrong, though they make great games, and I think are misleading. The other 4, I think, are quite good models, but students will struggle to play them. And the last 2 are too long to play in the classroom. And students can't just read the rule book and play them if they're not hobby wargamers. So I do think you have to be careful. I think generally it's better to design your own game and go with one of those first 3 or 4 examples I gave you than to try and make a commercial board game designed for something else work well in the classroom. But they can work well in the classroom if you know what you're doing and you thoughtfully adapt them. Just a couple more things I'm going to say, and then I'm going to finish. It is possible to combine all those gaming techniques into really giant games that have board games, they have negotiation games, they have other kinds of games going on. We do this quite regularly. The first 3 there, War and Binny, Apocalypse North, and Atlantic Rim, are all games being run at McGill with 120 students. 8 hours of gaming. They did it for fun. Not necessarily serious topics, because Apocalypse North is a zombie apocalypse, and Atlantic Rim is giant kaijus, monsters appearing in Atlantic Canada. But we modeled the entire Canadian Armed Forces down to the company level in them. So the civil military response part was 100% accurate. We just said, how would the Canadian forces and the RCMP and so forth respond if we had zombies coming across the American border? We're always worried about things happening in the US, particularly recently, so it wasn't far off. Dire Straits was a multiple simultaneous crises in East Asia during the Trump administration, which was a rather more serious game to the extent that the Trump administration was serious. At KCL. And there was multiple games and mini games and linked games. You could also potentially do live action role play. This is something I just ran in Abu Dhabi for CNN journalism training simulation, 5 days set in a conflict affected country where we had fake news conferences, fake interviews, a really complicated story, a fake social media environment, our entirely closed Twitter-like thing, and an entire war zone, which is hard to find in Abu Dhabi. So that is actually Abu Dhabi at the bottom left. It's not the part you usually see. But there is a movie lot in Abu Dhabi, so we had a movie lot to film on. And we ran the students through reporting a complex story in a conflict-affected site with the locals, the politicians, the activists, the local inhabitants, all paid by CNN journalists, and that's a real CNN camera crew there working with the students. We had ridiculous levels of resources in Abu Dhabi, so normally you don't have access to a ruined city, but I asked them if they could lay on airstrikes next year, and they seem to think it was a possibility, so I'll keep you updated. Digital games, I've so far talked about manual games. Digital games are too expensive and take too long to develop for classroom use. They cost 10 times more, my pen has exploded. They cost 10 times more and they take much longer than a manual game. They do. I mean, I work on digital game development, but they are slow and expensive and they're hard to change once you've designed them. There are a few purpose-designed games for the international relations classroom. Statecraft at the top right is probably the best. It is purpose-designed to be an online IR simulation, and it has a lot of supporting documentation on how you should use it in the class, because you can use it well, you can use it poorly. There are a lot of commercial off-the-shelf digital games you could use, but again, they may not be evident to students how they work. That's one of the Total War series. That's Napoleon Total War at the bottom right. I love it, but it's not unusual for me to put 200 play hours into a campaign, which you can't reasonably ask your students to play, and there's a lot of complexity in that game. So you have to understand that not all of your games that are self-evident to you, if you're a gamer, may not be self-evident to your students, and you need to keep that in mind. So there, what I've done, the paper talks a lot more about the design steps, about how you need to design for audience, how you need to design for resources, and so on and so forth. And it talks a bit about these game things, but I thought it would be nice to visually see them actually being used in a variety of settings, and why they were used that way and some of the strengths and weaknesses. So at this point, Bassel, I will throw it open to questions.
Thank you so much, Rex. Thank you. We have 10 minutes for questions. We'll start there.
Just a second.
Do you want to take 3 questions or 1?
It's probably better to take 1 or 2 and then answer, because they might.
It's working? Okay, thank you. My name is Tomasz Szmura. I'm from Kazimierz Puławski Foundation from Poland. My foundation also conducts numerous war games, including computer-assisted. And I agree with you that it's very difficult to strike a balance between including like many factors to remain realistic in designing the war game and to make sure that it's still playable, especially if you have if you would like to have some senior decision makers or military guys involved by many hours. But my question is about your approach to design the war games. There are, of course, to remind to make sure that this game is realistic, you need to include the objective factors like order of the battle, the size of the units, the firepower, but there are some factors which are very difficult to measure. For example, like morale or willing of the forces to fight, which are still very, very important. We see each every day on the Ukrainian battlefield. So how do you include, these difficult, unmeasurable factors, in your war games you are designing? Thank you.
So I'll answer that one at a time. It's an excellent question, and really it requires you think in advance what variables are going to be important, because there's lots of games that don't adequately address morale issues and motivation issues and training issues and logistic support issues. And if you think they're important, you need to build them into your game. Now, you can model them in all kinds of ways. You can have a modifier to combat effectiveness, which reflects quality of training. You can put command and control lags in. If you think that your red commander doesn't have strong control over their military forces and it takes them a time to reorient, then you can put delays into the time before they give you new orders. Lots of games do have logistics rules, and units run out supply and so forth, but that's the critical part about asking objectives at the beginning and thinking, what do we need to put in here? And also, what do we not need to put in here? What's unnecessary detail? So the NATO example where we're using Command Professional Edition was really it was a game about intermediate force capabilities, but Command Professional Edition has far too much detail. It shows you every single missile flying. And so instead of us being focused on the bigger picture of were these capabilities valuable on the battlefield, we were all staring at every single anti-ship missile, hoping it would hit the frigate or hoping it would miss, depending on which side we were, which I was theater commander. I should not have been doing that. Theater commanders don't sit there tracking every single SAM and every single anti-ship missile to see whether it'll hit or not. So the game was, in fact, too detailed on some of the combat mechanics. I didn't need to know that because we were playing at the level of theater commanders and divisional commanders. We weren't playing at the tactical level of ships captains or pilots or commanders of SAM batteries. So there may be some detail you can afford to take out. I will mention, since you work in Poland, the Doctrine Training Center and the Polish Armed Forces has just published a guide on wargaming, which is on their website for free. So, and they're ahead of most other NATO partners because only the Brits have done that. So that makes Poland #2 in the world in terms of actually, maybe we could count the US in terms of putting out wargaming doctrine publications. So well done, Poland.
What are the limitations of wargaming? What I have in mind, like Secretary Rumsfeld once said, we know what we know, we know what we do not know, we do not know what we do not know. September 11 was failure because of lack of imagination. Once I played war game with US intelligence agency, I was asked to play Ayatollah Khamenei. It is very hard to put yourself in somebody's shoes. Again, my question, what are the limitations of wargaming? Thank you.
So there's always going to be, as I said before, usually it's a single run through history, it's a single game, and so there's lots of things that could have happened that don't show up in the game. We don't want to put too much weight on what a war game is telling us. It's a kind of plausibility probe about things that might happen. It's not a forecast of things that will happen. We can have players who have difficulty role-playing characters. I don't think you need another Ayatollah Khomeini to be an Ayatollah Khomeini, but it may be that some people are better able to play that role than others. And so I think think you need to do some social engineering in character assignments to get people who you think can get into that role very well. There's all kinds of other problems. The model might be wrong. It might be asking the wrong kinds of questions. The game you play may be driven by a strong personality who distorts the game. You talked about wargaming with seniors in Poland. It's a big problem when you have senior officials at a war game that junior officials don't want to tell them that they're wrong and the emperor has no clothes. So you have to think, it's great to have seniors because it means that your ideas are being taken up. They're also a bit of a curse because everyone else may say, well, no one may be willing to say, well, sir, actually, our weapon system doesn't work that well. It turns out that the probability of hit is 1/10 of what we think it is. But no one wants to say that to the general who procured it. So if you have seniors, you have to work out some system to make sure that critical voices will get voiced in the war game and they won't be killed by hierarchy. Students are great. They will say anything. I mean, if they think you're full of it, they will tell you. Sometimes passively aggressively or what have you, but students are great. Military officers are deeply problematic because they are hugely hierarchical and you really have to work at making them say things contrary to what seniors have just said. So military officers can be a real problem in terms of pulling creativity out of them. Students are terrific. They come up with all kinds of cool things. But a game is not perfect. It is simply a tool. And I see it as just another way of coming at the problem. It's just another, in what in the intelligence community we call an alternative analysis exercise to simply ask the question in a different way to see if we get the same answer or if we get a different answer.
Rex, I have 3 issues very quickly. One about same as a pedagogical technique. And one unexpected, I agree on the problems and the benefits. One of the unexpected results was that the students get too interested and neglect other courses. And hence, you get some protest and tension with your colleagues. Did you ever meet that?
Yes.
That is the first
gosh, yes.
That's the first issue. The second issue is, I know that the origin of gaming was with the armed forces and all of that. But since we are actually expanding the issues, I did some simulation about water problems, which are becoming more and more central. And shouldn't we change the name from wargaming to something like policy-making games? Because it is getting much wider, and especially since we are dealing with critical security studies. Number 3, last point, what were, from your repeated experience, what were the findings that were most interesting and the ones that were most counterintuitive, that you didn't expect at all?
Okay, so that last one is a really interesting question. Let me start with the first 2 to give me time to think about the third. So the peace-building simulation I used to run at McGill was 7 days, 12 hours a day for 120 students. And as Bassel and Omar will attest, having been TAs at McGill, our undergraduate students are really keen. And they would not sleep for a week. I mean, we had cases of sleep deprivation, people wandering out of their apartments, having nightmares, and getting locked in buildings because they were so busy working at McGill, they hadn't realized the buildings had been shut down and so forth. So my colleagues grew used to it. And I would warn the students, you won't get any work done this week. And fortunately at McGill, it became a bit of a tradition that everyone understood that if you were doing the Brynenia simulation, you would live and sleep it for a week, and that you couldn't practically expect to do any other work. But yeah, there were times when, because I'd have students, some of the students would set up on campus radio networks so they could be called out of class with earphones if a ceasefire broke down, and some profs didn't like it when a student would slip out the back because a fictional ceasefire had broken down and they wanted to deal with it. But most of my colleagues were actually pretty good. But they can get very keen. Another way they can get keen, which you have to, I think the first one is less of a problem, it's just managing your students and managing your colleagues, is sometimes students will be so anxious to win that they will do unrealistic stuff that will help them win. There's a study by a Swedish instructor at the Defense Academy of them using conventional digital war games for teaching military tactics until the students discovered that if you put your administrative units in front of your combat units, the Russians had to slow down to kill the cooks and the clerks before they reached your positions. And since the cooks and clerks were not important in the simulation, you could sacrifice them. So Swedish military cadets were putting lines of support personnel in front of their forward edge of battle in order to force the Russians to slow down to kill them in the digital game, because it worked. And that's not really something, as a former signaler, I don't particularly want to be deployed a kilometer in front of the forward edge of battle to get killed in order to make the Russians give away their plans. So they had a problem with the students exploiting weaknesses in the software to win the game, and therefore engaged in negative learning. All games can produce negative learning, and that's why the paper talks a lot about the importance of debriefing, understanding what the students have experienced, correcting misperceptions, and so on and so forth. So that is a big problem with the game. A game can produce negative learning because of artifacts of the game, and you need to correct that. You need to be on top of that. So that is another aspect of students really wanting to learn. I engage in wargaming, but I usually call it, my course is called conflict simulation at McGill. It's not called wargaming because environmental conflict, absolutely. Conflict over where to build a new stadium in a town, absolutely. Urban planning conflict, absolutely. Or I use serious games. So, the stuff on epidemic disease response, for example. So I don't usually use wargaming. I would use whatever term works with your audience. So the military and the business community love wargaming. It's laden with testosterone and it sounds really tough. I would never go to Save the Children and say, let's run a war game. I'd say, let's run a serious game about disease response. So just use the word that works with your audience. Most surprising findings. So I ran a game for the Atlantic Council on crisis stability in the Gulf, in which the Atlantic Council was arguing, this was before the 2016 elections, that whichever new president was elected had to make a stronger security commitment in the Gulf region and a stronger commitment in the Middle East for all kinds of positive reasons. And we had a very innovative game design where we ran 2 simultaneous games, and some players were in both and some players were just in one with less US resources and one with more US resources. The US did less well in the game with more resources because it gave them more opportunity to mess things up in the Middle East, right? And in the game with fewer resources, they were actually more thoughtful in what they did and asked questions. And so the finding of the game, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, is that US hubris can be a problem in its regional foreign policy, and that giving them an extra aircraft carrier or an extra $1 billion in aid does not necessarily make US foreign policy more thoughtful. It may just enable it to do more damage. That was not the finding that the Atlantic Council want. It was a very senior panel with, a former UN ambassador and a former national security advisor heading it up, and they forgot about the game. So they ran the game, and they didn't like the findings because it ran entirely counter to the point they wanted to make, which is about increased US commitment in the Gulf. There were a lot of interesting findings from that game. Another was that the Iranian team didn't actually care how many US carriers were in the Gulf because they never planned to fight the US Navy. And so at the end of the game, it turned out they hadn't once discussed US military deployments in the entire game, any of them. And since my game had a lot of retired admirals, they were extremely upset that the Iranian team had failed to even notice the presence of the US Navy. And the Iranians said, well, we're not going to fight the US Navy. How stupid do you think we are? We'll do cyber, or we'll step up support to the Houthis, or we'll support opposition movement somewhere, but we're not going to go take on a carrier. And the people from the Pentagon were very upset to discover that their sailing carriers through the Straits of Hormuz had not even been a subject of discussion. It wasn't that the Iranians had discussed it and dismissed it. They hadn't once noticed. They just thought it was unimportant. So I thought it was a great finding, but it was not a finding that the participants were comfortable with because it popped a few Washington Beltway balloons. And so the report was published, but then it was never ever mentioned again by the Atlantic Council. So.
Still good morning, Marzena Żakowska, War Studies University. Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation and outline different part of the war game, different kind of the war game. Following this is my question, did you already play negotiation war game regarding the situation in Ukraine? Did you already have opportunity to create some scenario, how will look the negotiation to bring the peace to and end the war, of course, in the Ukraine? If yes, what was the outcome of the game? What was the learning process?
So I have not done any war games or negotiation games on the current situation in Ukraine. I did a couple of Ukraine-ish games beforehand, which were not about understanding the situation in Ukraine. They were understanding things like proxy warfare and hybrid warfare and information warfare and cyber, and it was essentially disguised Ukraine scenario. So it was fictional countries, but it was inspired by the pre-war situation in Ukraine. But I haven't done any Ukraine war games. I think if Ukraine war games were done in government at this point, they'd be fairly heavily classified because of the sensitivity of those results coming out. Because even if a problem in government is sometimes you want to do a war game just to help you think about a problem. It's not because you're testing something out or you just want to think about the problem, but the mere reporting of the fact you ran a war game could be misunderstood. So if Canada decided to do a war game on negotiations to end the Ukraine war, there would be a real risk that even if the purpose of that game was just to understand if it was possible or good or what have you, it would show up as someone saying NATO partners are wargaming to try to force Ukraine. So sometimes you don't run war games because they're too sensitive. And this is a problem in NATO, that many NATO issues are sensitive, not just externally vis-a-vis the Russians, but are sensitive internally. I mean, the Greeks and the Turks, or the Turks and the French, or just wait till the Swedes and the Finns join. And this, I mean, so in some cases, NATO, or the rise of the Trump administration, most of NATO saw the rise of the Trump administration as a serious national security threat. We certainly did in Canada as one of our major national security threats. We sure as hell couldn't wargame about it for fear that it would leak and the Trump administration would find out that we were running games about the threat of the Trump administration. No, it's not a casual thing for us. We have one of the highest rates of trade dependency in the world with the US. 85% of our GDP is tied up with bilateral relationships with the United States, with the Trump administration. So, I mean, it's hard to think of a small country suddenly being choked by its powerful neighbors as we sit here in Doha. But it would be too sensitive to wargame unless you did it at a very high and closed level, in which case no one would be talking about it. So there can be a problem about issues being too sensitive to wargame, and particularly in coalitions or alliances. So I think it's a big problem with NATO wargaming as NATO, as opposed to US wargaming or UK wargaming or what have you. There's just important topics that are too sensitive to wargame.
Thank you, Rex. My name is Bassel Salloukh. I teach strategy and warfare here at the program. And I use a limited version of seminar gaming in my classes. I was wondering if you could tell us more about forms of assessment in an educational setting. So I understand that all students, and I have them in the class, and probably it's more active in your class that students would be much more interested in participating in the games. But how do you use assessment, and do you use assessment at all as part of the gaming?
So that's a really an interesting and important question. You can assess students for their participation in a game, but the problem then is that students will do stuff to earn grades, and they will be hyperactive thinking that that's how they earn grades, and they will be hyperactive when they in fact should be doing nothing in the game. Right? Because sometimes the best optimal course is to not do anything in real life. So I always had a very tiny portion of the grade based on actual participation in the sim, because if it was high, I worried it would distort game behaviors. And because fortunately, McGill, motivation is not an issue. It's more you need to go to sleep. You can have them write what I think the best thing to do is have them write end of simulation reflection exercises, in which what did they learn from the sim, but also what was wrong with the simulation. That's a very important thing to get into thinking about. So I've run a game, it's a model of reality, but it can never be a perfect model of reality. They should be critical consumers of games, and they should understand what the game didn't address. Perhaps there were key actors missing. Perhaps the game was biased towards certain types of behavior and not other types of behavior. Perhaps there was no one in their team who knew anything about economic warfare or cyber, and they felt that they couldn't respond. So have students do a reflective exercise about what they learned, but also a critique of the game proves that they're thinking about the game, and also is super useful in changing the game for next year. If they understand that giving you honest, thoughtful feedback, even if it's negative, is something that you want from them, it's super, super useful. The other thing too is to let them know if there's a final exam, that there may be questions based on the simulation. You know, this happened in this simulation, which IR theory does this best model to? Or so you can do things to fit the simulation material into the final exam so that they think it's relevant. And if there are students who seriously want to go on in security studies, I think you give them the adult talk that one day you may be doing stuff. It might be civil defense stuff, it might be military stuff, it might be security stuff, it might be foreign policy stuff, you might be reporting as a journalist, but the consequences of your actions are real. You know, you can make things worse. People can die. You can fail to respond. So, you know, take this seriously, because it's far better to make the mistake here where we're dealing with simulated lives than to be in the real situation in 10 years in your career and you didn't take it seriously. One of the best compliments I ever get on Brynania is I will get students emailing me or contacting me otherwise from Darfur or North DRC or what have you, saying, just wanted you to know I now work for so-and-so, and this situation came up yesterday at work, and it reminded me of the sim a decade ago, and I want to thank you again. And I get those every once in a while. I think, you know, yes, you know, it's not just that they did the assignments in the course, it's that years later, they're contacting me to say, you know, I just wanted you to know. I just did this huge sim that I showed you for CNN. The reason is because the senior producer who's head of CNN Academy was a McGill student and thought that the sim at McGill was his best learning experience and wanted to replicate it for journalism students. So, you know, tell them that, take this seriously, because presumably you're studying this because you think you're going to be using it in your future career, and it's far better to fail now than it is to fail later. The broader point there is you learn a lot from mistakes, and you want students to understand that this is what we call a safe to fail environment. You don't expect them to be perfect, and on the contrary, people are going to make mistakes, and that's where the learning is. So.
Hi, Rex. Hi. Really interesting. In some ways, building on this, and you've partly answered it, but how do you get players to link back their behavior, which is often kind of, you know, minute to minute, very kind of empirically kind of direct, to theories behind what they've been learning? And I mean, you're saying a bit about sort of, mentioning the scenario in the exam, but what do you do, for example, with practitioners? I mean, we trained the Foreign Office for a couple of years, and we had we put them in a war game in Syria, and they had to kind of work out all these things, and then we had sort of a brief reflection on the end where we linked back to the analytical sort of paradigms we discussed with them in the week before the kind of the game, as a kind of way to try and link them back to the theory, and particularly when you're doing critical sort of security studies, it is very important that you think about, you know, the concepts that you use, the power relations, etc. So, can you give us any insights how you did that?
Okay, so one thing is, if one of the advantages, the reason I used a fictional environment for my peace building simulation is it allowed me to build in all the dilemmas and debates that exist in the literature into the real situation, or the fictional situation. So I engineered a country that was the manifestation of the literature. It had conflict resources, it had the demobilization of combatants, it had repatriation of refugees, it had this, it had that, and it was all built in there so that students would have to live the literature they read in the course. I think in the debrief you can ask them to think about those things, but I actually think it's easiest with critical security studies because that's often about subaltern views, that's about alternate views. And much as in the game where the US Navy was told by the Iranian team, actually, we paid no attention to your conventional military resources because we weren't planning on fighting you, and that's not the way we saw our security issues. You can run a game in which it turns out that the locals all hate the UN because they find them as a bunch of meddlesome outsiders. There's a terrific game by Jim Wellman called The Village, which is about a fictional post-Civil War Britain with a Bangladeshi peacekeeping contingent in a British village, modeled roughly on the radio series The Archers, in which most of the players are British villagers trying to go about their daily life, whereas all the peacekeeping people are focused on the peacekeeping stuff and the insurgents and arms smuggling. And that game inevitably ends up with a lot of angry villagers, angry over things like, why did you put the checkpoint in front of the pub? It takes forever to get there right now. Or why did you drive your tank through my field? Or no, that wasn't a sniper in the woods, that was the poacher. And and why have you ripped up all the roads with your tracked vehicles? And it's a brilliant game because most of the players are the locals, and it's got this whole peacekeeping thing on it. And the peacekeepers are genuinely trying to be nice and loved. And you do the debrief, and they're hated for all these really small things. Like, as I say, a key one is your checkpoints really screwed up the traffic flow in the village, and no one's coming to the pub anymore because they're going to the next village over because they don't want to go through the checkpoint. And it forces people to think of these subaltern views. So I think it's actually very easy in a simulation when you do the debrief to have your players talk about how they perceived other players, and they will soon discover that their internalized view of their role, particularly if they kind of see themselves as white knights who are galloping in to rescue the poor locals from themselves, that's not their real view. The locals will say, we didn't see you that way, we thought you were rather imperious, or we thought you were really stupid, or we were just playing you, and don't you know what was really going on? And that can be an incredible learning moment. So that game, you should talk to Jim Wellman, who's based in the UK, about that game, because I absolutely love that game, because the main game is just going on with your daily life. Like, you're trying to organize the church fete, and you're one of two rival pubs, or you're a couple of rival farmers, or you just try to do it, and the peacekeepers just seem to be getting. A couple of you are insurgents, but most of you are just normal people trying to get on with your lives, and the peacekeepers just seem so annoying and dense. And it's not their fault, because they have no idea what's going on. They don't understand the social fabric of the village. They don't understand the dynamics. They're from outside. They have to work, in the coolest version of the game, they have to work through a translator, and they're not even allowed to talk to the locals directly. And so you get that whole translator dynamic in there too. It's a really clever game. So I actually think that critical security studies are really easy to do with games in terms of unlocking alternative perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you, Rex, so much. Fascinating talk as always. That one is on the military studies side. And a question and a comment. So the question is, did you find the centralized, let's say, combat formations versus the decentralized? The centralized, when they have the command centralized, similar to how the most Arab fights, sometimes it's successful, most of the times it's not, but October 73 with Egypt, was very clear, versus the more of the mission-type tactics, decentralized formation, Wehrmacht style, IDF style, now the SAU style, the Ukrainian armed forces. Did you find results in terms of any, is there better, let's say, military effectiveness or better combat performance when you find this in the war games? That's one, but I have also a comment on that brilliant student who put the cooks. Maybe it's not the Western way of warfare, but actually the Russians has done it with the convicts, with prisoner convicts. And the units who did this, which is the Wagners basically, were advancing in Bakhmut and Solidar, whereas everybody else, the conventionals, in a retreat in Kherson and a collapse in Kharkiv. So that, the Ukrainians were killing prisoners who were cannon fodder, not useful, whereas they were losing their elite. So I'll give the student an A on that one.
There's a bit difference between that and putting the entire administrative capacity of your army in the front lines to die just because the game doesn't give them any useful role. So on the issue of centralized versus decentralized warfare, one would want to design games to explore that. I wouldn't try to interpret that indirectly from games that were designed for other purposes, because some games simply don't allow you to decentralize, or if you decentralize, the AI is not particularly good, so you're not actually testing the value of decentralization. You're testing in a digital game how well the AI for decentralized units functions. So I think you could design games around testing that, because there are also disadvantages to decentralization too, in terms of sharing information, or a common operating picture, and so on and so forth. I did run some games on a fictional Russian invasion of Estonia with defense colleagues, but not for a serious purpose, just because we wanted to run them. And one thing we did notice was that obvious headquarters died very quickly, and that because between drones and precision fires, a company, and certainly a battalion headquarters, was visible really quickly if you didn't take a lot of effort to hide it. And the two sides were just going around stonking each other's battalion headquarters. And so you had to be decentralized. Our Russians were less so. Their order-changing process was more ponderous, and so they really suffered when they started losing headquarters, which was also seen in Ukraine in terms of using precision strikes and targeting data, which both the Ukrainians and their allies develop on Russian headquarters. So I think you can test that, but I think you always need to design a game for a purpose if it's an analytical game, and there is a danger in trying to draw conclusions from a game designed for other purposes. So that was one question. What was the other question? That was, yeah. I do want to say one thing before we end, because after Bassel's intro, I don't think we ever told Bassel that, but for 20 years at McGill, the prime rebel military unit besieging the southern city of Mogadishu was named the Martyr Bassel Salloukh Battalion. In every simulation we ever ran, there'd be these heroic announcements from the Martyr Bassel Salloukh Battalion. So entire two generations of McGill students know you as the martyred leader, not that you ever were, of one of our rebel units. So.
Well, I know we are beyond time, and so I will stop it here. I know we can go on forever with Rex, but let's stop now. Thank him for his great presentation, and you can continue in the coffee break.